You are about to hear the story of a man who was slapped with a $100,000 fine by a corrupt HOA, threatened with foreclosure, and backed into a corner so tight he had no choice but to reach for the unthinkable. They thought they had him beaten. They thought they could extort him, seize his property, and walk away clean. They didn't count on the one thing that would ultimately bring their entire tyrannical board crashing down: the secret legal clause that allowed him to turn their own. Archaic bylaws against them, resulting in the most devastating financial judgment ever levied against a suburban HOA. By the time this was over, not only was the HOA president personally bankrupt, but the entire board was legally forbidden from ever holding office again in the state. This is the story of how a small, seemingly innocent garden shed became the battleground for a six-figure legal war that ended with utter and sublorious destruction. Welcome back to the channel, Scandal Survivors. If you've ever had a Karen try to ruin your life over a blade of grass, you know exactly what kind of firestorm you're about to witness. This is pure, unadulterated HOA anarchy, and trust me, you do not want to miss a single second of this delicious payback. Right now, before we dive into the madness, absolutely smash that like button, subscribe for your daily dose of injustice and sweet revenge, and let me know in the comments, what is the most ridiculous HOA rule you've ever heard? Let's get into Chapter 1. Our story begins in the pristine, overly manicured enclave of Whisper Creek, a neighborhood that was less a community and more a meticulously controlled terrarium for the financially secure. Our protagonist is Mark Jensen, a quiet, retired engineer who simply wanted to enjoy his newly built workshop, his haven. The conflict, as always, came in the form of the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac, Mrs. Bethany Thorne, the HOA board president. Bethany was a woman who believed the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, or CCRs, were less a legal document and more her personal divine decree. Mark's initial sin was minor, almost laughably so. He installed a custom-built, high-quality timber shed in his backyard. Now, this was not some rickety prefab disaster. It was a beautiful, architecturally sound structure, painted to perfectly match his home. Mark had submitted the plans to the HOA Architectural Review Committee, which consisted of Bethany and two of her perpetually nodding friends, 3 months before construction. 3 months passed with no response. Silence, in the world of Whisper Creek, was often taken as tacit approval, or at least a sign that the paperwork had been swallowed by the bureaucratic void. Mark proceeded. He needed his workshop, and the CCRs stipulated that if the committee failed to respond within 60 days, the plan was deemed approved. This was his first and crucial defensive line. But Bethany Thorne didn't care for rules that didn't suit her. The moment the shed's roof went up, the notices started. At first they were polite, if icy, a request for an expedited review. Mark ignored it, confident in the 60-day rule. Then came the violation notice 1, unauthorized structure, complete with grainy telephoto pictures taken from the yard of one of Bethany's lackeys. The fine, a paltry, almost insulting $100 per day, commencing retroactively from the start of construction, which they inaccurately listed as 3 weeks prior. Mark's blood began to boil. He penned a professional, legally precise letter citing the 60-day rule, attaching the certified mail receipts showing when he sent the initial plans. He believed that would be the end of it. It was, in fact, only the spark that ignited the bonfire. Bethany Thorne didn't like being cited for her own incompetence, and the petty dispute escalated immediately. The daily fine jumped overnight to $500. Letters stopped being polite requests and became thinly veiled threats of legal action. The final letter of Chapter 1 arrived like a punch to the gut, a formal demand for payment, listing the accrued fines, now at a shocking $14,000, and a new non-negotiable demand. Bethany, through the HOA's lawyer, claimed that the shed was a major deviation from the neighborhood's aesthetic standards, a standard that apparently only existed in her head. The demand concluded with a chilling line: if the structure was not demolished within 7 days, and the $14,000 paid in full, it would place a lien on Mark's property and commence foreclosure proceedings. Mark looked out at his beautiful, authorized shed, then down at the threat, and a cold, dangerous resolve settled over him. He knew this wasn't about the shed anymore. It was about power, control, and extortion. He would not back down. Mark responded to the threat the only way a man of principle can, by refusing to yield to tyranny. He consulted a real estate attorney, a sharp young lawyer named Sarah Chen, who assured him he was legally in the clear. The 60-day rule was ironclad. They drafted a counter-demand, citing the CCRs, accusing the board of bad faith, and threatening a lawsuit for harassment and punitive damages. This, Sarah explained, should cool Bethany's jets. It did not. It had the opposite effect, driving Bethany into a frenzy of vindictive fury. The next HOA board meeting was a farce. Mark showed up with his lawyer, ready to present his legal defense. Bethany and her two loyalists refused to even let Sarah speak, citing an obscure, non-existent rule about outside counsel. Mark was given 5 minutes, during which Bethany constantly interrupted him with dramatic sighs and eye rolls. In the end, they voted 3-0 against him. But this time, the board didn't just reaffirm the existing fine. They weaponized their power. The next notice that landed on Mark's doorstep was a masterpiece of pettiness and malice. The total fine was suddenly $36,000. Backdated and including an escalation fee, but that wasn't the outrageous part. The board had convened a special emergency meeting with the sole purpose of amending the neighborhood's bylaws. They had quietly slipped through a new clause, Article 7.3b, which stated that any structure built without explicit written consent and causing significant aesthetic disruption, to be determined solely by the board, shall be subject to a one-time penalty equal to $5% of the property's assessed value. Mark's home was assessed at $2 million. Do the math. The new, immediately effective, non-negotiable fine was exactly $100,000. $100,000 levied against him for a shed that had been, for all intents and purposes, approved. Sarah Chen was apoplectic. This was not just bad faith. It was potentially a legal amendment procedure, but the damage was done. They filed the lien. They moved for foreclosure. Mark's bank, despite his excellent credit, informed him that due to the substantial lien on the property, his refinancing application was frozen, and his insurance was being reviewed. He was financially suffocating. The worst part is Bethany, empowered by her board's rubber stamp, started spreading vicious rumors throughout Whisper Creek that Mark was a deadbeat, a scofflaw, that his shed was structurally unsound and posed a risk to the community. Mark felt the neighborhood turn against him, his neighbors suddenly looking away when he passed. He was isolated, facing financial ruin and staring at a forced sale of his home. Because a power-mad HOA president didn't like his custom timber shed. He sat alone in his living room, staring at the legal notice demanding $100,000, his lawyer promising a slow, expensive court fight that could take years, and he realized he was truly helpless against the HOA machine. They had one, or so they thought. Helplessness is a powerful motivator. For Mark, it drove him not to despair, but to meticulous, exhaustive research. He knew the HOA's power was built on paper, and somewhere in their mountain of dusty paper, there had to be a flaw. He spent weeks poring over the original 1980s CCRs, the association's corporate filings, and every meeting minute from the last decade. Sarah Chen handled the initial legal response, stalling the foreclosure with aggressive filings, buying Mark time. And then, at 3 a.m. one cold morning, Mark found it. Not in the recent amendments, but in the original, archaic founding document, Article 12, subsection C, the Indemnification and Dues Clause. It was a relic, a clause almost certainly overlooked by every lawyer and board member since the 80s. It's designed to protect the community from gross negligence. Stated plainly, should the board of directors be found by an independent auditor to have levied a fine, assessment, or fee exceeding 50 times the annual general dues, where such levy is subsequently deemed invalid by a court of competent jurisdiction, the board members who voted for the levy shall be personally and severally liable to the association for the full amount of the initial levy, plus attorney's fees, and shall be subject to immediate and irrevocable removal from their posts. 50 times the annual dues was exactly $2,000. Mark's $100,000 fine hit the trigger perfectly. Mark rushed this to Sarah. Her eyes went wide. This was a nuclear option. Turn the legal fight from a defense of the shed into a direct personal attack on Bethany Thorne and her two cronies. Sarah filed the lawsuit not just as a defense against the fine, but as a derivative action suit filed on behalf of the HOA against its own board for breach of fiduciary duty and financial recklessness. The evidence was irrefutable. The 60-day rule clearly approved the shed. It's making the $100,000 levy fundamentally invalid. The court date was set. The courtroom was packed. When Sarah presented the ancient Article 12, subsection C, the color drained from Bethany Thorne's face. The judge, a man with little patience for suburban drama, listened to the evidence of the original approval, the subsequent illegal amendment, and the final, extortionate fine. His ruling was swift and devastating. The $100,000 lien was immediately dissolved. Mark's shed was officially approved, and then he lowered the boom. He ruled that the $100,000 fine was, indeed, invalid, and that, under Article 12, subsection C, the 3 board members who voted for it, Bethany Thorne and her 2 co-conspirators, were personally liable to the HOA for the $100,000, plus Mark's full legal fees, which amounted to an additional $30,000. The judge ordered the immediate removal of all 3 from the board and referred their actions to the State Attorney General's office for review of potential corporate misconduct. The gavel slammed down, and in that moment Mark Jensen had won more than his shed. He had achieved a total catastrophic victory. The immediate fallout was delicious. Bethany Thorne, the self-proclaimed Empress of Whisper Creek, was utterly ruined. The judgment wasn't against the HOA, but against her and her 2 lackeys personally. The 3 of them were now on the hook for $130,000. The 2 cronies immediately tried to throw Bethany under the bus, claiming they were misled, but the judge's order was clear: joint and several liability. They were all equally responsible. The court-appointed receiver immediately went after Bethany first, due to her being the ringleader and having the most liquid assets. Her high-end SUV was seized. A temporary lien was placed on her personal bank accounts. She stood on her own manicured lawn, screaming at the process server, a scene that quickly went viral on the neighborhood message boards, a sweet irony given her public shaming of Mark. The HOA itself, now run by a temporary board consisting of genuinely reasonable neighbors, was thrown into chaos. They discovered that Bethany, in her zeal to persecute Mark, had diverted nearly $15,000 in regular HOA funds toward her aggressive legal tactics without proper authorization. This was now another debt the old board was personally liable for. The neighborhood dynamic instantly shifted. Neighbors who had shunned Mark suddenly rushed over with apologies and casseroles. The power of the truth and the sweet scent of justice was intoxicating. But Mark was not done. He had won the war, but the scars from the malicious foreclosure attempt remained. His credit score had taken a temporary hit, and the emotional toll was immense. The immediate payback was watching Bethany crumble. She was forced to sell assets to pay her portion of the $130,000 judgment. Her social standing evaporated. The moment of true, immediate, satisfying revenge came when Mark was walking his dog and saw a moving van parked outside Bethany's massive home. She was not just selling her assets. She was selling the house itself. The cost of her vindictive crusade, her illegal power grab, was the loss of the very pedestal from which she looked down on everyone else. The new interim board, comprised of Mark's former sympathizers, quickly voted to repeal the illegal Article 7.3b and, in a final symbolic move of contrition, sent Mark a letter formally apologizing for the actions of the prior board and offering to pay for a celebratory dinner for him and his attorney. Mark politely declined the dinner. He had a different kind of settlement in mind, one that would guarantee no one like Bethany Thorne would ever threaten Whisper Creek again. The removal of the old board and the financial ruin of Bethany Thorne was a victory, but Mark wanted to safeguard a legacy of his struggle. His final masterful move was a negotiation with the new reformed HOA board. He agreed to forgive the remainder of his legal fees that were still outstanding from the personal judgment against the 3 former members, a total of about $10,000. The HOA permanently adopted 2 new amendments to the CCRs. The first was a good faith enforcement clause, which required a third-party mediator for any fine exceeding 10 times the annual dues, essentially making it impossible for a rogue board to levy exorbitant penalties. The second, and the most satisfying, was the Bethany Clause, a new bylaw requiring any board member who is removed by court order for corporate misconduct to pay for the cost of a full independent. legal review of the entire CCR document, and to fund a mandatory annual ethics training seminar for all subsequent board members, payable for the next 10 years. It was a perpetual financial punishment for any future abuse of power, directly tied to the precedent set by Bethany Thorne's downfall. The new board, eager to stabilize the community and grateful for the reduction in legal fees, unanimously passed both amendments. Bethany Thorne, now living in a rental condo across town, was personally saddled with the first installment of the Bethany Clause costs. The final nail in the coffin came 6 months later. The State Attorney General's office, concluding its review, issued a public administrative finding stating that Bethany Thorne and her 2 cronies had acted with reckless disregard for their fiduciary duties and had levied assessments for the sole purpose of personal vendetta. The AG's office permanently banned the 3 of them from holding any elected or appointed position in any homeowners or property association in the state of California. It was a legal corporate death sentence. Mark Jensen, meanwhile, had his beautiful, authorized shed. His legal fees were covered, his name was cleared, and he had permanently inoculated his community against future tyranny. He was now a legend in Whisper Creek, a quiet man who had faced down an enemy armed with paperwork and one with a hidden clause and unyielding resolve. The shotgun he had metaphorically grabbed was the truth, and he had fired it with surgical precision. And that is how a $100,000 fine over a garden shed resulted in a total HOA nuclear meltdown and one of the most satisfying legal victories we have ever covered. Can you believe the audacity of Bethany Thorne? Let me know the most shocking moment in the comments below. Was it the $100,000 demand, or the ancient clause that brought them down? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next saga. And share this video with anyone who needs a little dose of HOA payback. We'll see you in the next one.